So you actually fly those things, or is that just what the Navy puts on the brochure? Brent Lawson said it with a grin, loud enough for the people around us to hear. A few heads turned. Someone near the open bar gave a polite laugh. My father-in-law, Harold Caldwell, smiled too. Not because the joke was funny, but because Brent was the kind of man Harold never corrected in public. I had been back in Norfolk for 3 days. 3 days after months at sea, and I still woke before dawn, expecting to hear metal vibrate under my feet. The night before, I had fallen asleep on the couch with my duffel bag half unpacked and one boot still on. But Harold's company was celebrating 40 years in business, and my husband Ryan had asked me for one favor. Just come for an hour, he'd said. Dad will make it weird if you don't. I should have known weird was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Caldwell Precision Systems had started in Harold's garage outside Chesapeake and grown into a respected supplier of aerospace components. The ballroom was lined with photographs of machine shops, ribbon cuttings, defense executives, and military aircraft using systems that included Caldwell-made parts. That was the irony. Harold loved the military when it appeared on a contract. He just never seemed to respect it much when it showed up as his daughter-in-law. When he introduced Ryan, he spent nearly 2 minutes talking about business school, expansion into 3 states, and the new manufacturing line Ryan had helped launch. When he got to me, he touched my elbow and said, "And this is Claire. She's with the Navy." With the Navy. Like I worked in a gift shop near the base. I smiled anyway. I was 35, a lieutenant commander, and a tactical naval aviator. I had learned a long time ago that correcting every person who underestimated you was a good way to spend your whole life exhausted. Then Brent arrived. He was Harold's executive vice president, golf partner, and unofficial loudest man in every room. Brent had never served, but he had spent 20 years selling to defense contractors, which apparently convinced him that reading procurement briefs made him an expert on combat aviation. He shook Ryan's hand, ignored mine for half a second too long, then noticed the small gold wings on the lapel of my navy blue dress. "Well, look at that," he said. "Harold never told me we had a Top Gun in the family." His tone made it clear he didn't mean it as a compliment. "I fly," I said. "Carrier?" "Yes." He lifted his bourbon. "In this day and age, though, how much flying is really flying? Computers do most of it, don't they?" Ryan's jaw tightened. I could have answered him. I could have told him what a pitching deck looked like at night when the horizon disappeared. I could have explained what it felt like to trust your training while every nerve in your body said something had gone wrong. Instead, I said, "The computers are helpful." Brent laughed, pleased with himself. That was when the leather strap on my watch caught against the cocktail table. It had been cracked for months, and the salt had stiffened it. I took the watch off and set it beside my glass. A woman standing a few feet away stopped in the middle of her conversation. She was probably in her late 50s, silver-threaded through dark hair, wearing a simple black pantsuit. Her eyes dropped to the back of my watch. There were only 3 words engraved there. Asterisk, bring them home. Asterisk. Her expression changed so quickly I almost thought I imagined it. She looked from the watch to me. "Excuse me," she said quietly. Brent was still talking, but I barely heard him. The woman stepped closer. "Where did you get that?" she asked, and for the first time that night I felt something other than irritation. I felt my stomach tighten. I looked down at the watch, then back at the woman. "The crew of Rescue 6 gave it to me," I said. For a second she didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on those 3 words. "Bring them home!" Like they had reached across the room and touched something private. Then Brent called my name from behind me, and the moment broke. "Claire, come take a look at this," he said. "Maybe you can tell us if the Navy approves." The way he said it made a few people laugh again. The woman gave me one last look before stepping back. "We'll talk later," she said quietly. I didn't know who she was, but something about her tone stayed with me. A few minutes later, everyone moved toward the main presentation area. Caldwell Precision was unveiling a new flight control component they hoped would become the centerpiece of a major defense contract. Harold had been talking about it for months. There were local officials in the room, executives from 2 aerospace firms, and enough people wearing American flag lapel pins to stock a campaign headquarters. Brent loved that kind of room. The lights dimmed. A large screen behind the stage displayed a flight simulation, while Sophie Morales, one of Caldwell's younger systems engineers, stood near the control station. Sophie was maybe 27, sharp, quiet, and clearly nervous about presenting in front of the company's biggest clients. The demonstration began normally. Then the simulated aircraft started drifting off its approach path. Sophie froze. A warning flashed across the screen. Brent immediately leaned toward Harold. Software team screwed something up. I was standing 15 feet away, but the numbers caught my eye. Something about the load calculation was wrong. I moved closer to Sophie and kept my voice low. Check the weight input against the approach profile. She looked at me, confused. Why? Because your software isn't failing. It's correcting for data it shouldn't have. She hesitated for half a second, then started typing. The aircraft stabilized almost immediately. Sophie stared at the monitor, then at me. How did you see that? I shrugged. I've had arguments with airplanes before. She laughed under her breath, mostly from relief. Before she could say anything else, Brent stepped up beside us. There we go, he announced loudly. Exactly what I thought. Input issue. Good catch. Good catch. His catch. I watched Sophie's expression change. She opened her mouth, and I knew exactly what she wanted to say. I touched her arm lightly. Don't. Not because Brent deserved protection. He didn't. But Sophie had a room full of senior executives watching her, and I wasn't going to let him turn her successful recovery into an argument about credit. Sometimes proving you're right in the wrong moment costs somebody else more than it costs you. The presentation continued. Brent spent the next 10 minutes explaining the system like he had personally designed every line of code. I stood near the back of the room and tried not to think about how familiar it felt. People who had never sat in a cockpit loved talking about how technology removed risk. They saw screens, automation, checklists. They didn't see the moment when the warning tones started stacking on top of each other and you had 3 seconds to decide which one mattered most. For just a second, the ballroom disappeared. I was back over black water. My gloves were slick inside my hands. Rain hammered the canopy hard enough to sound like gravel. Someone was breathing too fast over the radio. Ghost 2, hydraulic pressure is dropping. Then another voice. Rescue 6 has lost visual. I remembered looking at the fuel numbers. I remembered knowing exactly how bad they were. And I remembered hearing myself say calmer than I felt. Nobody gets left out there. Claire? Ryan's voice pulled me back. You okay? Yeah. I picked up my water glass. Just tired. He knew me well enough not to push. Unfortunately, Brent didn't. He wandered back toward us after the applause ended, bourbon refreshed, confidence fully restored. You know, he said, this is what civilians don't understand about defense. People think pilots are the whole story, but guys like us are the reason those airplanes stay in the air. Sophie was standing behind him. Her jaw tightened. Then Brent looked directly at me. No offense, Claire. At the end of the day, pilots are basically the end users. I could have embarrassed him right there. Instead, I smiled. Funny. Airplanes never called me that. Sophie covered a laugh with her hand. Brent's face hardened for just a moment. That tiny reaction told me something important. He didn't actually want conversation. He wanted hierarchy. And I had stopped giving it to him. That was when the woman in the black pantsuit appeared beside me again. This time, she wasn't looking at Brent. She was looking straight at me. Claire, she said. I turned. She nodded toward the watch, still sitting on the cocktail table. Who exactly on Rescue 6 gave you that? I hesitated. The whole crew signed the card, I said, but Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Shaw handed me the watch. Her face went completely still. Then she asked the question that made the noise in the ballroom seem to disappear. Daniel Shaw is my younger brother. For a second, I thought I had heard her wrong. Daniel Shaw is my younger brother. The woman said it quietly, almost like she was afraid saying his name too loudly would pull something painful back into the room. I looked at her again, really looked at her this time. The steady posture, the way she watched people before speaking, the expression that never quite reached surprise, even when she was surprised. Then I understood why something about her had felt familiar. Mom, I said. I didn't know. She gave me a small nod. Most people don't. Before I could ask anything else, Brent's voice cut across the room. Well, there you go, he said, chuckling as he stepped closer. Small Navy world. He had no idea what he was walking into. That was the strange thing about men like Brent. Silence made them nervous. If they didn't understand something happening around them, they filled the gap with their own voice. Harold joined us a moment later with two potential clients from Arlington. He was still riding the high of the presentation and clearly wanted Brent doing what Brent did best, talking. Someone asked me how long I had been flying. 12 years in naval aviation, I said. Brent raised his eyebrows. 12 years? See, that's what surprises civilians. Rank makes everything sound more dramatic than it is. Ryan turned toward him. Brent. No, come on, Brent said. We're all adults here. There's a difference between having flight hours and having actual operational credibility. I felt Ryan move beside me. Enough. It was the first time all night he had said it loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Brent blinked. Ryan continued. You've spent the entire evening taking shots at my wife. Drop it. For a brief second I was proud of him. Then Harold stepped in. Ryan, nobody's taking shots. Brent's just talking shop. That hurt more than Brent's comments. Because Brent was exactly who I thought he was. Harold was family. And even now, standing 6 feet from me, he was still more worried about keeping the evening comfortable than asking why his executive thought humiliating his daughter-in-law counted as conversation. Brent smirked. Your husband's getting protective. I looked at him. No, I said. He's getting tired. That got a few nervous laughs. Brent didn't like them. Then the woman beside me spoke. I think we've heard enough. Her voice wasn't loud, but the people around us stopped talking. She extended her hand toward Harold. Rebecca Shaw. Harold smiled automatically. Rebecca Pleasure. I don't believe we've met. No, we haven't. She paused. Captain Rebecca Shaw, United States Navy. The smile on Harold's face changed. Brent's did too. Rebecca wasn't there because Caldwell had invited her as some high-profile guest. She had come with Dr. Martin Green, a retired aerospace engineer who had worked with the company years earlier. To Harold, she had simply been another name on someone else's +1. Brent recovered first. Captain. Well, then you know what I mean about operational experience. Rebecca looked at him for a long second. I know exactly what operational experience means. Something in the way she said it finally shut him up. Then she turned to me. Claire, January 17th, North Arabian Sea. My chest tightened. I hadn't heard someone say the date like that in years, Rebecca continued. What was your position in the stack? The room around me seemed to blur. I could smell rain again. Jet fuel, hot electronics, black ocean underneath us. Ghost 2, I said. Rebecca stared at me. Not at my uniform because I wasn't wearing one. Not at the wings on my dress. At me. You were Ghost 2? I nodded. Her hand rose to her mouth for half a second. That was the moment Brent finally stopped smiling. Rebecca looked around at the small crowd that had formed. My brother was aboard Rescue 6 that night. Nobody spoke, she continued slowly. The helicopter lost navigation reliability in severe weather while supporting a recovery operation. Conditions deteriorated faster than forecast. Visibility collapsed. Fuel margins got ugly. Aircraft started reaching their limits. I didn't want this story told at a company gala. Not like this. Not with people staring at me. But Rebecca wasn't praising me. She was remembering her brother. Ghost 2 was providing cover, she said. When another aircraft had to break off, somebody had to keep the corridor organized long enough for Rescue 6 to get clear. Brent shifted his weight. Rebecca looked at him. That somebody was Claire. I could feel every eye in the room. The truth was less cinematic than people liked to imagine. There had been no heroic speech, no music, no certainty. There had been checklists, bad weather, fuel calculations, voices stepping on each other over the radio, and one terrible moment when I realized everyone was waiting for somebody else to make the decision. So I made it. I stayed. Longer than I wanted to. Longer than was comfortable. Long enough. Rebecca's voice softened. Daniel told me Ghost 2 kept everyone calm when they started losing the picture. She coordinated the approach, kept communications clean, and refused to abandon the rescue corridor until they were clear. Brent tried to interrupt. I'm sure it was a team effort. Rebecca turned toward him. Of course it was. Brent looked relieved for half a second. Then she finished. That's what good leaders understand. His relief disappeared. Rebecca looked back at me. Your aircraft developed a hydraulic problem on the return, didn't it? I nodded. Nothing dramatic. She almost smiled. My brother described it differently. A few people laughed, but nobody was laughing at me anymore. Rebecca touched the edge of the watch on the table. Daniel told our family something after that deployment. He said the reason he remembered Ghost 2 wasn't because she acted fearless. She looked directly at me. He said she sounded scared and did her job anyway. That hit me harder than all the praise could have, because he was right. I had been scared. Terrified, actually. For years I had hated the way people turned courage into some magical personality trait, like brave people simply didn't feel what everybody else felt. We do. We just keep working. Then a voice came from behind Brent. Mr. Lawson? It was Sophie. She had gone pale, but she was standing straight. Brent turned. What? She swallowed. Claire also fixed the simulation error tonight. His expression changed instantly. Sophie continued before she lost her nerve. She identified the incorrect weight input. I corrected it because she told me exactly where to look. One of the clients from Arlington glanced at Brent. I thought you said you caught that. Brent's face went red. I said it was an input issue. I never said you said exactly what I thought, Sophie replied. There was something almost beautiful about watching a quiet person finally decide she had been quiet long enough. Harold looked from Sophie to Brent, then to me. I watched the realization settle across his face. This was no longer about a rude joke. In less than 10 minutes, Harold had discovered that the daughter-in-law he had spent years minimizing had quietly helped save his biggest presentation, while the executive he trusted had taken the credit. And suddenly, for the first time that night, Harold Caldwell had absolutely nothing to say. Harold finally found me 20 minutes later near the loading entrance behind the ballroom. I had stepped outside because I needed air more than I needed another conversation. The night in Norfolk was damp and warm, and somewhere beyond the parking lot I could hear traffic moving along Hampton Boulevard toward the naval station. Inside, the gala was still going on. People were still drinking, shaking hands, talking contracts. It was strange how a room could keep functioning after your entire relationship with someone had just changed. Harold pushed through the metal door and stopped a few feet away from me. For once, he didn't look like the owner of Caldwell Precision Systems. He looked like a tired 63-year-old man who had suddenly realized he had been wrong for a very long time. Claire, I turned. He rubbed one hand over his face. I owe you an apology. I said nothing. I didn't know, he continued, about Rescue 6, about what you'd done. Hell, I didn't even know you were involved in things like that. There it was, the apology that almost understood the problem. Almost. I looked at him. Harold, that's not why you owe me an apology. He frowned. I don't understand. The problem isn't that you didn't know what I'd done. He opened his mouth, but I kept going. The problem is that you thought I needed to have done something extraordinary before I deserved your respect. That stopped him. I had carried that sentence for years without knowing I was carrying it. Every Thanksgiving when Diane introduced me as Ryan's wife who works for the government. Every Christmas when Harold asked Ryan about revenue projections and asked me whether I would ever want a normal job. Every time somebody made a joke about military pay and they looked at me like I was supposed to laugh too. None of those moments had seemed big enough to start a war over. That was how these things worked. Nobody broke you with one giant insult. They chipped at you, then acted surprised when you finally noticed the pile of pieces on the floor. Harold looked down at the pavement. I thought I was being practical. You were being dismissive. He nodded slowly. I can see that now. No, I said. You can see tonight now. I need you to understand the years before tonight. That was harder for him, I could tell. A person can apologize for one bad evening. It takes more courage to admit that the evening exposed a pattern. The door opened again. Ryan stepped outside. He looked from me to his father. Am I interrupting? No, Harold said. Ryan walked over and stood beside me. Then, to my surprise, he looked at me instead of his dad. I owe you one, too, I sighed. Ryan, no, let me say it. His voice cracked just enough that I knew this wasn't something he had rehearsed. I kept telling myself I supported you because I defended you when we got home. That hit harder than I expected. Ryan looked toward the parking lot, but I let them say things in the moment because I didn't want to make dinner awkward, or Thanksgiving awkward, or Dad's birthday awkward. He laughed once bitterly. I protected everybody from discomfort except you. I felt something in my chest loosen. Not disappear, just loosen. That's what I needed you to understand, I said. He nodded. Inside, things were changing too. Sophie had apparently decided that once she told one truth, she might as well keep going. By Monday morning, 2 other engineers had contacted Human Resources. One said Brent had taken credit for a design improvement she had developed. Another had emails showing Brent blamed his team for missing a deadline after he personally delayed approval for 3 weeks. Harold called an outside HR consultant instead of handling it quietly in-house. That mattered. A week later, Brent was suspended pending an internal review. He called me once. I didn't answer. Then he sent a message saying he wanted to clear the air. I deleted it. I wasn't interested in revenge. But I also wasn't obligated to provide him the relief of being forgiven on his timetable. There's a difference people don't talk about enough. Forgiveness can be generous. Access is optional. Rebecca called me a few days later. She asked if I would speak at a mentoring event in Virginia Beach for female ROTC cadets, young engineers, and military spouses trying to enter aerospace careers. I don't really do hero speeches, I told her. Good, she said. They don't need a hero speech. What do they need? Somebody who will tell them what competence looks like before anybody claps for it. That made me smile. So I said yes. Back at Caldwell Precision, Harold had a choice to make. He could treat Brent as one bad employee, issue a statement, protect the company's reputation. Or he could ask the harder question. What kind of culture had he built if people like Sophie had learned that staying quiet was safer than telling the truth? For the first time since I had known him, Harold didn't reach for the easy answer. He ordered a full leadership review, and that was when I began to wonder if the worst night our family had experienced might actually become the first honest one. 3 months later, Caldwell Precision looked different. Not dramatically different. There wasn't some movie-style transformation where everybody suddenly became kinder and every bad habit disappeared overnight. Real change doesn't work like that. But the little things had started moving. Engineering teams were now required to document individual contributions on major projects. Junior employees could raise concerns through an outside reporting channel instead of going directly through the same managers they were worried about. Harold approved a paid internship program for veterans, military spouses, and engineering students from community colleges across Hampton Roads. People who didn't always have the connections to get through the front door of companies like his. Brent never returned. The review found enough problems that Harold gave him the option to resign before termination. He resigned. I heard he told people the company had gone soft. That sounded like Brent. Sophie got promoted 6 months ahead of schedule. When she texted me the news, she added, **, still checking the weight inputs. **, I laughed harder than I probably should have. Harold changed too, although I wouldn't call what happened between us forgiveness. Not yet. He stopped introducing me as Ryan's wife, who was with the Navy. The first time I noticed was at a backyard cookout that summer. One of his neighbors asked what I did, and Harold simply said, "Claire's a naval aviator." Then he stopped talking. No Rescue 6, no dramatic story, no borrowed glory. He let me decide what came next. That meant more to me than another apology. Diane had a harder time. She had spent years believing respect meant knowing the right people, sitting at the right tables, sending your kids to the right schools. One afternoon she surprised me by admitting something I never expected. "I think I kept minimizing what you did because I didn't understand it," she said. And instead of admitting I didn't understand, I decided it wasn't important. That was probably the most honest thing she had ever said to me. Ryan changed in smaller ways. At family dinners, he stopped waiting until we were driving home to tell me someone had crossed a line. He spoke when it happened, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes too loudly, but he spoke. And I learned something too. People talk a lot about setting boundaries as if it means making some grand announcement and cutting everyone off. For me, it was quieter. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen. A few weeks before my next deployment, Rebecca asked me to speak at that mentoring event she had mentioned. I almost backed out twice. Then I walked into a community auditorium in Virginia Beach and saw rows of young women wearing ROTC polos, engineering school hoodies, Navy ball caps, and the nervous expressions of people trying to figure out whether they belonged in rooms that hadn't been built with them in mind. Afterward, a 19-year-old cadet waited until almost everyone had left. "Mom?" I turned. She twisted the strap of her backpack around one hand. How do you stop being afraid people will figure out you're not good enough? I knew that question. I had asked myself versions of it at 22, 25, 30. I could have told her about carrier qualifications. I could have told her about Rescue 6. Instead, I said, "You don't wait for the fear to disappear." She looked disappointed. I smiled. You build evidence for yourself. You study. You train. You show up prepared. You make mistakes and learn from them. Eventually, when a room doubts you, you don't need that room to tell you who you are. She nodded slowly. Then I added, don't spend your whole life trying to convince a room that you have value. Become someone you can trust when the room turns against you. 2 weeks later, I was back on the flight line. The air smelled like salt, exhaust, and jet fuel. My watch was strapped around my wrist. The scratches were still there. So were the words on the back. Asterisk, bring them home. Asterisk, for years I thought they were only about the people we brought back that night. Now I understood them differently. Sometimes the person you have to bring home is yourself. Not the version your family approves of. Not the version your boss can use. Not the version strangers find impressive. Just you. I pulled on my helmet and walked toward the aircraft. Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. And for the first time in a long time, that felt exactly right. The deepest lesson in Claire's story is that our worth does not begin the moment someone powerful finally recognizes it. Too many people spend years shrinking themselves to keep the peace, at work, in families, in marriages, communities, because speaking up feels harder than swallowing one more insult. But silence has a cost. When disrespect becomes a pattern, keeping quiet can slowly teach other people that your dignity is negotiable. Claire's strength was not that she had an extraordinary military record. Her real strength was that she knew who she was, even when the people around her did not. And that matters in ordinary life, too. You may never stand on a flight deck or face a room full of executives, but most of us will eventually meet someone who underestimates us, dismisses our work, takes credit for what we have done, or treats our kindness as weakness. In those moments, remember that respect should not have to be earned twice. Speak when something crosses a line. Support the person being talked over. Question the culture that rewards the loudest voice instead of the most honest one. If a relationship repeatedly asks you to trade your self-respect for acceptance, it may be time to change the distance between you. As the old saying goes, actions speak louder than words, and in the long run, character has a way of revealing itself. If this story made you think about someone or some moment in your own life, share your thoughts in the comments. If you've lived through something similar, your experience may help another person feel less alone. Please like the video if it spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about dignity, courage, consequences, and second chances. Wherever life finds you today, I hope the noise settles, the truth becomes clearer, and you find a little more peace in knowing that you never needed someone else's permission to have value.